Section 4 of Module 8 deals with the International Air Transport Association, also known as IATA. Admittedly, not the most exciting section that we'll ever have, but IATA plays a very important role in the relationship between the airlines and the freight forwarders, among other important things that they do. But for purposes of our conversation, certainly from the perspective of a U.S. importer, we want to know about IATA because it very much runs the relationship between the freight forwarders that a U.S. importer will work with and the airlines that carry the cargo. This section is very much an exercise in broadening our frame of reference about U.S. air imports. Okay, who is IATA? The International Air Transport Association is the trade association that represents the world's airlines. Those are actually their words from their website. IATA was founded in Havana, Cuba in 1945, by no coincidence the same year that World War II ended. Its headquarters, a little odd, is in Montreal, Canada, but there are 260 airline members from 117 countries, basically covering all the serious players that are involved in both passenger and cargo movement. Second bullet, to summarize what we just said, IATA definitely covers activities for both passenger traffic and air cargo. As a trade tip, and really what is most important to us as U.S. importers, is that the organization is also very involved in integrating the forwarder and airline relationship from a documentation perspective, from the use of technology perspective. A good example of technology being electronic or e-airway bills, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. The key factor for us as importers is IATA runs the show in terms of the relationship between the forwarders and the airlines. As the representative of the world's airlines, IATA develops operational as well as accounting standards and tools in a number of areas. This accounting component, once again, very important to the airlines and the forwarders, but also important to shippers, importers, and exporters for that matter, because IATA helps to run the numbers component. Who gets billed what and in what quantities? That becomes important to the shipping community. Let's see some of the details as to why. Well, financial settlements for airlines, cargo agents, intermediaries, and air freight forwarders. That's the whole accounting piece. How much the airlines charge the forwarders, how they settle their payments, etc., which ultimately trickles down to the relationship with the shipping community. Passenger and cargo security, that's a big deal. Ground operations, the handling of cargo on the ground. Loading and offloading of aircraft, physical plant, all of those things. Of course, they're involved in safety and aircraft tracking, any regulatory considerations, and naturally, environmental stewardship too. Let's talk a little bit more about the cargo side of things, because naturally that's what most interests us. As part of its cargo-specific value proposition, IATA works in 5 strategic areas. Global standards and tools. E-airway bill, electronic airway bills being a very good example of that. We talked about financial services and industry solutions, transformation projects and industry mobilization, taking advantage of the internet being one good example, partnerships and industry collaboration between IATA and the airlines, but the airlines with each other as well, and advocacy and outreach. It's a trade association at the end of the day, so IATA is going to represent its airline members. Let's talk a little bit more about cargo-specific activities by saying with regards to cargo, IATA provides standards, training, and services in the following areas, which again trickles down through the forwarder relationship to the relationships with the shipping community, importers and exporters. Operational considerations, accreditation, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in just a moment, but how IATA gives accreditation to airlines and forwarders to meet certain operational and financial standards. More on that in just a second. We talked about those accounting and financial services, publications and regulations that we'll talk about more in just a moment, but things like dangerous goods handling, and then important for the overall air import industry is the training component. This slide, as we see in the title, deals with IATA's accreditation for cargo agents and forwarders, the two main players in the air freight industry. The airlines that run the assets, the aircraft themselves, and the forwarders that serve as the middle person between the import-export community and the airlines. IATA administers a certification program for cargo agents and air freight forwarders, referred to as Cargo Agency Accreditation. Cargo Agency Accreditation establishes industry recognition for both operational and financial competence in the air cargo field. Let's stop here for a second. IATA will set the standards for operational know-how, how to handle air cargo, basically, but also set certain standards for the financial competence of these entities, of the carriers, of the freight forwarders, because it is very important to the air cargo industry to have players that are financially solvent and will follow the rules for settlement of payment, etc. Once again, that trickles down to the shipper community because U.S. importers don't want to be dealing with fly-by-night operations either as air carriers or freight forwarders. Last bullet on this slide, accreditation also subjects the forwarder-airline relationship to IATA resolutions. These are the rules and standards that upon becoming a member and accredited by IATA that the carriers and forwarders agree to adhere to. As one can see, IATA plays an important role in the overall ecosystem of the global air freight market. Continuing on with accreditation, these programs mandate that air freight forwarders demonstrate operational competence, they know how to handle cargo, financial solvency, as we said a moment ago, and an established track record in the air freight industry. This keeps the amateurs out of the marketplace. That's an important consideration too. Second bullet, Cargo Agency Accreditation requires training in specific areas. Naturally, air cargo management. And here we're talking about the handling of dry cargo, but also perishables, the physical handling component, the documentation component, best practices for building up pallets, unit loading devices, etc. This is important stuff. And then, of course, second sub-bullet, dangerous goods regulations. Anyone that has been on an aircraft as a passenger would agree that the proper handling of dangerous goods on an aircraft is pretty important stuff. IATA takes care of that too. Last bullet, and this will come up again when we look at documentation and such, but once accredited, forwarders receive an IATA code that can be used to conduct business with member airlines. That code is what identifies a forwarder with the airline and legitimizes the relationship, not only operationally, but financially. That payment settlement mechanism too. We can wrap up this section with a quick run through the publications and regulations that IATA publishes. The one on the right in our image just happens to be the dangerous goods regs, as they're called, but there are many others. As we see, IATA publishes a number of manuals that serve as the regulations for activity-specific air cargo operations. Depending on what we do as an importer, these regulations, these publications can become very important. Dangerous goods, we talked about, DG, as it's referred to. Live animal regulations. The movement of horses, for example. Panda bears that we see in the newspaper from time to time. Any variety of live animals. Perishable cargo regulations. Lithium battery shipping guidelines, a big deal in the age of smartphones. The Combined Cargo Conference Manual. And one that will come up for us a bunch of times in upcoming slides is the TACT, the Air Cargo Tariff and Rules. This is a publication, comes in hard copy but available online, that lists published tariff rates for air freight moves between specific airport pairs. More on that later, but the TACT is important. We'll go into some detail on it. That will wrap up this section. Upon our return, as we see in our title, we're going to get into types of aircraft, both passenger and all cargo. Lots of visuals, lots of pictures, some pretty interesting stuff. We'll see you soon.